All right, so we'll start here with Christian's image. And as you can see, it's named correctly. I see that at the very bottom here, the image name. But I don't have any metadata attached to this image, so you'll need to resubmit with metadata so that you can get credit for your image. No images with missing metadata will be given credit. That's against the academic honesty policy. And that limits my feedback that I can give to you. But some of the things that we're looking at. One is light, and you're using really nice light here. You have your subject close to a window, and the light's not strong coming from the window. So you moved him right towards the window in order to use as much of that light as possible. So that was a really smart move to get him close to the window and incorporate the window in the image. So it becomes a design element and it becomes part of the narrative here. So that was really smart, moving him close to the window. But overall, your exposure is still dark. So you would want about another stop or 2/3 of a stop exposure in order to allow his face to have that pop of light that we want. That would mean that the background would get blown out, but we would have better exposure on him, so our attention wouldn't get pulled out to the brighter areas. Instead, we'd have a bright enough subject that our attention would be right here. So your exposure is a little bit low, like I said, and then also we're seeing some digital noise here, quite a bit of digital noise. So you see that back here, how it's not a smooth gradient. And you'll often see it in the midtones on skin. So you'll want to bring down your ISO. Ideally, you're going to shoot with an ISO between 100 and 400 for all images. What you're communicating here feels like an intimate portrait, right? We're in your personal space or his personal space. Looks like we're in the kitchen as we see the sink in the background. And he looks really comfortable with us. He's giving us great eye contact. So a lot of that intimacy is coming through in this image. So that communication process was done well here. This next image is by Siyue, and you're at ISO 800, 50 millimeters, f5 at 1/20th of a second. So if we look at this image, we can see in the histogram, there's no information on the right side of the histogram. So you can have a dark image, and sometimes that will be correct, but here we can see this histogram doesn't properly represent the image. You should have more information on the right side of this histogram. So that's going to be probably about a stop more exposure here in order to get the proper exposure on your subject. And I can tell that you were shooting this in a dark area because of your exposure and because your shutter speed's really slow. And with that, we see that the image isn't quite sharp, that there was a little bit of movement that happened on your subject during the exposure. We can see that it's sharp here where she's really resting, but her eyes aren't quite sharp. So setting up on a tripod and then making sure that your subject's going to be very still for your image is key. But more than that, you could just bring in more light for this image. So shoot this instead of 9 o'clock at night, shoot this in the afternoon when you have window light, because that's going to give you the best light or best natural light to illuminate an image. It's going to bring in much more light than just turning on your household lights and using the ambient light from that. So I would really encourage you to shoot this at a different time of day where you have more light that's coming across. But she's on the couch. She has her hand over her face. She's giving us good eye contact. So that idea of communicating that this is someone that you're close with starts to come through. All right, this image is by Angelina, and you're at ISO 100, 47 millimeters, which is about a normal lens, f5.6 at 1/80th of a second. So those settings all look good. Your image is nice and sharp. The light that you're using is really beautiful. She's backlit, which makes for a trickier exposure, but you kept the exposure good on her. As far as the light goes, I might bring in a reflector to bounce a little bit of more light on her. And I would, if you have a professional reflector, I would bring in a gold reflector here because there's such a golden hue to this image already to really hold on to that with a golden, reflecting some golden light back on her, I think would work best. Like I said, we have some areas blown out in the background, and while I don't mind it in the background up here, I said that in my intro video in case you didn't listen to that. on her hair, that's where it starts to be a little bit of a distraction. So I would try to pull back on that, whether it's just diffusing a little bit of light, or moving her a little bit so you don't have that bright area on her hair. Because what happens is our eye goes to the brightest spot. So I'm continually going back to this bright spot opposed to just looking at her face. But what are you communicating with this image? She looks very calm in this image. She looks very comfortable with you. She's looking away from from the camera, but not in a way that's off-putting and makes us feel like there's distance. We still feel this intimacy with her just because of the comfort level that she has. So this is a great example of what we're looking for in this image. Also, by getting closer, we see her filling the frame, and I think that adds a nice element. Where here we have a lot of negative space above, and here again there's a lot of negative space around your subject. Just getting closer starts to communicate that idea of intimacy. This image is by Angie, and Angie, you shot this in color and then submitted it in black and white with like a sepia tone to it. So we'll look at the black and white image because I think that's your intent, right? And I say to only turn in one image, but I'm curious to talk about the color image as well. So here you're at ISO 100, 33 millimeters, so pretty wide angle. And remember that wide angle is going to create some distortion. So the back of the stairs feel further away than the front of the stairs, which I think works well. It creates more depth in the image, but then also her feet start to look larger than her waist would, right? So that becomes more of an issue. And it's just something to be aware of. You can use it to your advantage or it can be a distraction. F4.5, 1/640th of a second. So all those settings look good. The exposure overall looks good. You have really nice light coming in on your subject. It's hard light. You can see these hard shadows here. So it's not soft, pleasing light, but the way you have your subject set up, none of those shadows are coming across their face, so it's not a distraction at all. It allows us to get in there and see the detail, and really that harshness of the light isn't coming through. It isn't on the subject in a way that's interrupting anything or creating that hard feeling that hard light can do. So the light's really nice. And then again, like we saw in the last image, you've utilized the whole frame. So by showing the subject taking up most of the space from the bottom to the top of the frame, we feel closer to them. We feel that intimacy. And then knowing that you shot this with a 33 millimeter lens, so a wider angle lens, we know you were right up here with the subject. So that increases that sense of intimacy. Now you have this as black and white, and I thought it was brilliant as black and white. I think this is a really strong image. You're using the lines and the patterns and the textures and everything's working really well. But then when we see it in color, it shifts for me in a really interesting way where the subject is kind of muted and the background is shouting out to us. So the background has all this information. It looks like it says maybe Baton Rouge up here. We see, it looks like maybe a stadium of some sort. We see the architecture being represented in the painting here. And all of this is pulling my attention away from the subject. And then the subject wearing a white shirt kind of lets them fade into the background. So this feels like it's giving us a little bit more insight into their personality. So I think the black and white is more about just the subject. And this allows me as the viewer to read into the subject a little bit more.